In this video, we are going to look at 5 signs that indicate that the rapture window is drawing near, and perhaps we are already in it. Stay tuned. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainard. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, particularly truth in the prophetic arena, truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration. Today we're going to continue our investigation into the doctrine of imminence. Now, in the last video, I demonstrated that the rapture is not imminent in the sense of a random variable. It's imminent in the sense of, well, a probability variable that's based on objectively discernible phenomena. The fact is, imminence, whether in the Bible or in the world around us, is always sign-based. It's never a random variable. Now, the rapture is imminent in the same way that a volcanic eruption is imminent. It's based on signs. So with a volcano, for instance, there can be signs that indicate that an eruption is distantly imminent, or on the near horizon imminent, or on the very near horizon imminent, or even immediately imminent, and they're going to call for an immediate evacuation. So in the same way, the rapture is based on signs. The whole concept that the rapture is imminent is based on signs. There are signs that indicate that the rapture is distantly on the distant horizon. There's signs that indicate that it's imminent on the near horizon. There are signs that indicate that it's very near in its imminence, and there are things that would indicate that it's immediately imminent. Now, there's one caveat here when we're talking about the imminence of volcanoes and things like the rapture, and that is that we're dealing with ranges and probabilities. There is no exact science here. There's science, but it's not precision science. We can't ascertain or know the day or the hour with any degree of certainty, and we can't even determine the year with certainty when we're talking about the rapture. So how can we fit in imminence with what we observe in church history? I mean, throughout church history, men were looking for the soon coming of the Lord. So how do we reconcile that concept of imminence with the concept of imminence we're looking for signs? Well, it's really not that difficult. Throughout church history, men saw things in the world around them that indicated that they were in the last days in a broader sense, that indicated that the return of the Lord was on the distant horizon. It was seeable. It was knowable. And they lived with the hope that things would accelerate in their lifetime, and that they would get the privilege of seeing the coming of the Lord in their lifetime. Now, in our day, things are a little bit different. We're actually seeing things that are not indicating that the rapture is on the distant horizon or even on the relatively near horizon. They're indicating that the rapture is really near us. And we're going to look at these things today. Now, there are 2 classes of signs that in my mind suggest that time is short. The first one is the mathematical signs. And these signs follow the analogy of Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, to give and those signs gave a relative timing for the first coming. There's also stage setting signs, and these indicate that the world is descending into the chaos of the last days. Now, are some of you surprised that I mention mathematical signs? You shouldn't be surprised. In Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, we find a biblical precedent for calculating the coming of the Messiah at his first coming. And it calculated it to an exact date. Now, you need to understand that the precision here is misleading. Because those folks, even though they knew the exact date, they had no idea what that date was associated with. They didn't know if it was associated with the Messiah's birth. They didn't know if it was associated with his coronation or his anointing or his victory over the Romans or his public revelation. They had no idea what it was associated with. They didn't know for sure until after the fact, when they realized that it was associated with the triumphant entry, when the people in general, the people on the street were crying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So let's look at these mathematical signs. The first one is the Sabbath sign. Now, we're not talking here about the weekly Sabbath, and we're not talking about the Sabbath years that are involved in the Shemitah cycle. We're talking about the millennia Sabbaths. Now, this truth is understood when we take 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 in context, and we align it with Hosea chapter 5, verses 14 all the way up to chapter 6, verse 2, and we add in the promise of rest from Hebrews chapter 4. Now, 2 Peter 3:8 is a passage that says that the one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day. And in Hosea the end of chapter 5 in Hosea, and the beginning of chapter 6 in Hosea is where we read that the Lord is going to go away, he's going to depart. And that after 2 days, he's going to return to his people, and on the third day, they're going to be raised up in his sight. By the way, in Hebrews chapter 4, where it's talking about the promised rest, this is talking about the promised rest at the end of our pilgrim journey. It's not talking about the rest of faith that we can appreciate and enjoy right now during our pilgrim journey. Not trying to pour cold water on the concept of the rest of faith. But I'm telling you, that's not talking about the rest of faith that we enjoy during our pilgrim journey. It's the rest that we obtain in the promised land at the end of our pilgrim journey. But anyway, if we take this principle that we find in 2 Peter chapter 3 and we see in the end of Hosea chapter 5 and moving into the beginning of Hosea chapter 6, we see that there's 4,000 years from the garden to the cross, and there's 2,000 years from the cross to the kingdom. And this is plus there's 1,000 years in the kingdom. So there's 6 millennia, or 6 sets of 1,000 years for the saints to labor in the service of God in a God-hating world, and then there's 1,000 years or 1 millennia of rest. Now, if we put this together in our actual math, what we come up with is if the cross occurred at the Passover in AD 33, then the kingdom is going to begin at Passover in AD 2033. And that means, if we back up 7 years, that the tribulation is going to begin in the spring of AD 2026. But here again, the accuracy is misleading, because we have no idea whether the rapture is 4 weeks, 4 months, or 4 years prior to the beginning of the tribulation. And on top of that, we're going to have disruptions in the solar system during the tribulation that are going to throw off man's timekeeping. So even those trying to calculate the second coming are going to have problems calculating the second coming to the day or hour. If you want to understand more about this, go look at Luke 21:26 in context with the powers of the heavens being shaken. At any rate, this sign of the Sabbath, the millennial Sabbath, this sign points to a rapture window that we can say in a generic way basically begins in the summer of 2022 and continues all the way to the early spring 2026. In my mind, this is the window we're looking for the rapture. Now, the second mathematical sign is the rebirth of Israel. And this sign is found in Matthew 24, verses 32 through 35. And this sign, by the way, is the theme of my friend Tyler's YouTube channel, Generation 2434. Now, this sign has three parts. The first part is the fig tree, which is a well-known type of Israel. On May 14th, 1948, the cursed fig tree came back to life from the dead. And when this nation put forth its tender branches and put forth leaves, that demonstrated not only that the nation was alive, but it demonstrated that the summer or the harvest was near. Now, the second thing that we see in this passage is the parallel observation. Notice it says, likewise, that when the prophetic signs in this chapter start to come to pass, the second coming is close, even at the doors. Now, the third thing in this passage is the promise that the generation which witnesses the signs, starting with the budding of the fig tree, is not going to pass until all the signs be fulfilled. So how do we judge the length of the generation? I like to turn to Psalms 90 in verse 10. And there we read, as for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or if due to strength, 80 years. Now, we don't have to be hyper-technical with this 70 and 80 years, because as far as I'm concerned, it can be 80 and 90 years. The fact is, in modern Israel, the average life expectancy is now 83 years, whereas historically, back in these days, 70 years was considered the average life expectancy. Now, if we add 80 years to 1948, we come up with 2028. Very similar date to what we got above, with the beginning of the tribulation in 2026 and the millennium beginning in 2033. Now, how I put all this information together in my mind is that the generation which witnessed the rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948, that out of that generation, those that actually saw it and consciously remember it, there are going to be members of that generation alive when the tribulation starts, and they're going to be members of that generation alive when the Messiah descends from heaven. So what's the upshot of these mathematical signs? Since the rapture bears a fixed relationship to the 70th week and the second coming, and there's likely going to be maybe a year or 2 or 3 between them, but it's fixed. It can't be 20, 30, 50, or 100 years between them, much less 1,000 years between them. And because there's a fixed time that God knows exactly, and it's a short fixed time between the rapture and the second coming, we know there's a very limited window between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation. And this indicates, as we see that we're approaching the end of these numbers, then we know that we're approaching the end times, and we know that we're approaching the rapture of the church. And both of these signs indicate that we are closing in on, and maybe even already in, that rapture window. And if the rapture doesn't happen in the near future, then we're going to find ourselves in the tribulation. But we know that it can't happen that we're going to be in the tribulation. And therefore, we know the rapture is going to happen in the near future. Now let's look at the 3 stage setting signs. The first one is the geopolitical sign of the Russian juggernaut. And this is developed in the Gog and Magog prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and 39, where we see Gog and Magog and all of their allies attempting an invasion of Israel, and they're destroyed by a judgment of God. Now this involves a triad of nations. It involves Russia, who is the 4 Scythian nations. It involves Turkey, which is a mixture of the Scythian bloodlines and Scandinavian bloodlines and German bloodlines, plus the native people that were already there in Turkey. And it involves Iran, which is Persia in that passage. Now, we could say there's a quartet of nations involved if we're going to include Germany, which is Gomer in this passage. Now, 50 years ago, There was no indication that the Gog and Magog invasion was on the immediate horizon. Now, savvy students saw developments that indicated that it was probably on the distant horizon and that they could see this scenario developing. For instance, they saw that the Soviet Union had a strong presence in some of the Middle Eastern and African nations that are going to be involved in the Gog and Magog invasion. But there were difficulties that were in the way at that time. Russia and Turkey had a very turbulent relationship. And Turkey was a strong member of NATO. Iran was a U.S. ally and was even at more or less friendly terms with Israel. Now, today, things look radically different. Turkey's aims to be in the EU have greatly dimmed, and her membership in NATO looks ambiguous at best. Russia and Turkey have become very strong trading partners, and there are indications that their agendas in Saharan Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East in general, in Syria in particular, are beginning to converge. And the recent trilateral meeting between Russia and Iran and Turkey is extremely disconcerting to those that are following the events of the Middle East and Israel. Russia's relationship with Israel is beginning to unravel. It's beginning to deteriorate. This Ukraine situation is a thorn in the side for Russia, and Israel's relationship with Russia is being hindered because of Israel continually attacking Syrian targets and Iranian targets in Syria. The fact is, Russia has peacekeeping troops on Israel's border and a massive military presence in Syria. Well, maybe I shouldn't say massive, but it's big, it's significant. Another point to look at is that Russia's empire-building expansionism has already swallowed up Crimea and the Donbass in Ukraine. And it's likely going to continue until all of Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Black Sea nations like Moldova, Romania, and Bulgaria are completely swallowed up. On top of this, Russia's relationship with the West, particularly America, has become very strained, especially over the Ukraine issue, but not limited to the Ukraine issue. And Putin has recently declared that America is Russia's greatest threat. Finally, on this matter, there are indications that Russia and Turkey are on a path to embrace, for political and economic advantage, the same anti-Israel platform that Iran and the Arab world are already standing on. And when we look at all these developments pertaining to the Gog and Magog war, we see them accelerating towards the Gog and Magog war. We can only conclude that if these patterns continue, we are going to see Russian troop buildup in Syria and the other nations that border Israel, and we're going to see the same thing for Turkish and Iranian troops. There's going to become a massive buildup in the nations that surround Israel. Thankfully, the church is not going to be here to see these final stages of the buildup for the Gog and Magog war, because we are going to go up months before, if not years before, the final stages of this buildup. And when the church goes up, the torch of the testimony of God is going to be passed back to the nation of Israel once again, and a remnant is going to be gloriously saved. Now, the second sign is the sign of the perversion that reigned in the days of Noah. This sign is mentioned in Matthew 24:37. As the former world was overwhelmed with perversion, both sexual perversion and genetic perversion, before God responded with the judgment of the flood, so the present world, which is currently being overwhelmed with the same kinds of perversion is going to be answered by God with fire and earthquake and all the judgments of the 70th week. The world right now is on a trajectory and going at a pace that the whole world is going to be perverted with sexual perversion and genetic perversion within a decade. In this steeply, indeed exponentially increasing curve of perversion is a clarion call to the church that the rapture is near. And folks, Enoch was taken out of the world before the perversion in Noah's day reached its acme and judgment fell. And in the same way, the church is going to be removed from this world before perversion reaches its climax and judgment falls. Now, the third sign is the Great Reset, or the New World Order sign. Everywhere in the world, the government, both the shadow government and the formal government, is changing times and laws. Daniel 7:25. And they're taking counsel against the Lord and against his anointed. They're trying to free themselves from his cords and bands. We see this in Psalms 2, verses 1 through 3. And they're following lies taught by deceiving spirits. 1 Timothy 4, verse 1. And some of these lies include things like, on the plea of overpopulation, they're hindering marriage and childbirth. On the plea of reducing carbon pollution, they're restricting the consumption of God-given foods like meat and dairy. And they're offering mankind a wonderful vegan diet. Or worse, Soylent Green, which is going to be algae, and Soylent Brown, which is insects. They're restricting farming and ranching. And on the plea of a health crisis, they're mandating health care. Health care requirements, which in the name of healing, lead to serious health issues and infertility. All of these things are parts of a depopulation agenda that's aimed at reducing the world's population to 500 million or less within the next decade. And these New World Order movers and shakers are working towards a totalitarian government over the entire planet, where 99% of the people are going to be mere serfs, without freedom or property, dependent on the oligarchy for their basic life needs and entertainment. They're going to be under continual surveillance. They're going to have their thinking managed by thought police and social grading. They're going to be doing all their banking and shopping in a digital market, which is a medium that can be turned off and will be turned off for any infraction that offends the government. Men are going to find it difficult to survive unless they allow Big Brother to do all critical thinking for them. Men are going to be intimidated to never do critical thinking. They're going to have their carbon footprint monitored. What they can buy and what they buy, what they eat and how much they eat, how they're going to travel and how far they're going to travel. Now, folks often laugh when you say that this stuff is coming. But folks, some of this stuff is already being implemented in other parts of the world. And we see the movers and shakers of the New World Order plainly telling us that this is where the world has to go to survive. No, this is where the world is going to go because these New World Order people are led by the devil and they hate every institution of God. They hate marriage. They hate childbirth. They hate families. They hate children. They hate meat. They hate dairy. They hate health. And they're going to destroy it. Every one of them is going to be destroyed. Now, I said, as I was saying, this stuff's already being implemented in the rest of the world. And the New World Order leaders would implement it in the West in a heartbeat if they could implement it without having civil war. So currently they're rolling this out incrementally, little by little, like boiling the frog in the proverbial pot. And folks, if the New World Order shadow government pulls off their timetable, the world is going to be in their despotic system within a decade. The whole world's going to be trapped in a digital economic system that's like a fortress that you cannot leave. They're going to be buying and selling, and they're going to have their buying and selling regulated by political correctness and carbon footprints. How's that for buying and selling? You can't buy or sell unless you're politically correct and your carbon footprint is small enough. And unless you're a wealthy millionaire, you will never be able to afford a carbon credit. So you can't do any of the fun stuff that you used to do. They're going to severely limit energy consumption, and the world is going to be crushed with a famine of basic foodstuffs. Now, folks, the church is not going to enter into the fullness of these kind of iniquities because we are not going into the tribulation. But the depth of this iniquity that we already see, coupled with the evidences of an accelerated pace for the implementation of these iniquities, suggests that the tribulation is not far off. And folks, this means that the rapture is not far off. So in conclusion, when we look at where we are, when we look how deep into the gauntlet of iniquities that we are already find ourselves, these iniquities which are the stage setting for the tribulation. And when we see how deep we've gone into these mathematical countdowns that point to the end. And when we see that we're racing for a head-on collision with the events of the tribulation, events like the Gog and Magog war, events like the whole world engulfed in the perversion that prevailed in the days of Noah. When we look at that the dystopian system that's going to prevail in the last days is being built before our very eyes, then we see these things and we realize that we are looking at a very narrow window of imminence before us. And if the Lord doesn't remove the church in the very near future, we're going to blow right through this narrow window of imminence. We're going to come to the end of imminence. And we're going to find ourselves in the tribulation. Now we know that can actually happen. But this illustration makes a point. Imminence isn't random. Imminence is known nearness based on objectively discernible phenomena. And if we see the signs of the imminent rapture moving from near to very near, maybe even signaling immediately near, then we know that the rapture is just right around the corner. The rapture is at the very doors. And folks, if we aren't already in this very narrow rapture window, we will be in the very near future. And folks, we are not going to be in that rapture window very long. And then that trumpet's going to blow. We're going to meet the Lord in the clouds, and we are going to be with him forever. What a glorious day that is going to be. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.